Here we go. We are back with Cowboy Metal live stream. It is November 22nd, 2022. We're about an hour early, but we are broadcasting still from the great state of Texas, and we take no BS. Sorry, I'm just a wee bit late to the program. Zoom and YouTube were not working again, but we got it working. We're here, and everything is on track. This is going to be our pre-Thanksgiving edition. That's why we're starting about an hour early. Thank you for all the early birds that came to join us. We do have a poll up. The question is, do you remember the inflation of the 70s? So far, 71% say yes, 29% say no, and there is a wasn't alive but parents told me option if you're one of our younger crowd. Thank you for joining, Fantana Ranja, to the program. Good to see you here as we get people loaded in. I'll give it just a moment before we get started on the presentation. Doing a quick sound check. Sound is good. All right. The inflation of the 70s. You know, a quick story before we get started on the presentation. I was born in 74, and I remember growing up, we would go to the grocery store, and my mother would constantly complain about inflation. And it was, what I noticed was it took more money to fill up the shopping cart to the point we couldn't fill it up. And then we had to go with half shopping carts. And then it just became a problem. It was very hard for us to afford anything. And when I was 16 years old, we couldn't afford Thanksgiving dinner, but for the grace of my manager at work who knew my situation and had ordered basically a full cooked meal at the deli. And then the day before Thanksgiving on my shift, at the end of my shift, I was told to go back to the deli, and it was just labeled a friend, but I knew who had given it to me. And it was just a great Thanksgiving Day story. So I always remember that. And I'm always very thankful on Thanksgiving for everything that we have and, you know, the blessings that we all have. And it's one of my favorite times of year. It just always has been. All right. I think we've got some more people loaded into the live stream. Remember, there is a poll. Do you remember the inflation of the 70s? Yes or no? I just gave a little story there. I remember from my childhood. We're going to go ahead and get started on the share. And we're going to talk about a piece of research I came across when I was researching the past inflation, because I knew that the past period of inflation, the 70s and 80s, went for a while, but I really wanted to kind of dig down into some of the causes of it. And this story was written by somebody who works for the Fed, basically, and it's on a website called Federal Reserve History. And a lot of the stuff written here is by, you know, Federal Reserve bankers and people who work at the Federal Reserve. It's written by Michael Bryan, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And I just found it interesting. I want to talk about this a little bit because I think we're about to go through the same thing that's been documented here in this article, although I think we'll have a little bit different ending, or quite a bit of different ending, which I'll get into here in a moment. So the Great Inflation, they're talking about the period between 1965 and 1982. It was post-war. We kind of had that economic boom of the 50s and 60s. And then we started running into, we've got high inflation. And then it went into really high inflation. And Volcker eventually had to come in and kind of tamp it down with some policies at the central bank. Well, this is kind of studying that period and really getting to the bottom of what caused it. And here's basically the subscript of the title. The Great Inflation was the defining macroeconomic period of the second half of the 20th century, lasting from 1965 to 1982. It led economists to rethink the policies of the Fed and other central banks. I'm just going to read to you part of it and then narrate through some of this. I think there's some really good lessons here that are worth kind of sticking through this. The Great Inflation, that was the first paragraph. In 1964, inflation measured little more than 1% per year. It had been in this vicinity over the preceding 6 years. It began ratcheting up in the mid-1960s and reached more than 14% in 1980. It eventually declined to average only 3.5%. So that great inflation period is shown on the chart, 65 and 82. You can see where it started and just kind of kept going. And they got it all graphed out here. While economists debate the importance of the factors that motivated and perpetuated inflation, the origins of great inflation were policies that allowed for excessive growth of the money supply, Federal Reserve policy. So this is a guy with the Fed saying, yeah, the Fed caused great inflation last time. That's his words, not mine. I happen to agree with that, but I would add in governments and even people who wanted certain programs, which created all this need for all this debt that we'll talk about a little bit later in the program, were also a big part of it. So it wasn't the Fed coming in and just shoving the policies down our throat. The Congress is like, we need spending, you know, to do all these programs. So people are like, give us the program. So to some extent, we're all involved in this. Not that anybody really knew how it was going to blow up, because the first time, we had a central bank in America, even though we had failed currencies before. I can kind of see why people didn't understand this system till later, but that's the problem with voting in a system like this in the first place, like was voted in America, where the majority of people didn't even vote on it. The majority of Congress didn't even vote on this legislation, but it did go through. In any case, the first step of this was the Phillips curve and the pursuit of full employment. This is one of the most interesting paragraphs of the whole thing. So I'm going to read the whole thing. It says, the first part of the story, the motive underlying the Great Inflation, dates back to the immediate aftermath of the Great Depression, an earlier and equally transformative period for macroeconomic theory and policy. At the conclusion of World War II, Congress turns its attention to policies it hoped would promote greater economic stability. Most notable among the laws that emerged was the Employment Act of 1946. Among other things, the act declared it a responsibility of the federal government to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power, and provided for greater coordination between fiscal and monetary policies. The act is the seminal basis for the Federal Reserve's current dual mandate to maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. In other words, the reasons we've had all the bubbles really dates back to 46. It's 1913 with the Federal Reserve, but in 1946, it's Congress that then said, we need to blow this thing up. And it created the dual mandate for the Federal Reserve. That wasn't the Federal Reserve doing that. That was Congress saying, yeah, we need to use the power of the purse here to do all of these things. And I understand back then why they wanted maximum employment, because you just had World War II and the Great Depression, and we needed to kind of rebuild our economy and switch from a wartime to a regular economy. Congress knew this. And they also wanted maximum production. Why? Because you have to grow. They knew they had to grow to get themselves out of the debt they already had, that the war bonds and things from the war. There's a tremendous amount of debt that was created. They had to grow. They had to increase production, or you're risking the insolvency of the American government. And that would have been a really damn big deal. And also, what was the last one? Oh, purchasing power. Well, that's the one that's failed because we've had inflation. And if anything, we have an increased purchasing power, which happened when we were on a gold standard, not a gold standard with fiat dollars, but just on gold as money. We always had reduction in inflation. We had deflation in prices, which is good for savers. But with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, this is something I documented in depth in my book. That's when we switched over to that paper system, and that's when we started having persistently high inflation. Again, doing a real quick sound check. Sound is good. Thank you for people that have joined the live stream. We're now up to 81. We enjoy having you. This is a little bit earlier than in most weeks because it's Thanksgiving Day week. So we want to do this one a bit early and get out of here and let you guys go enjoy your holiday. Oh, by the way, before I continue with the story, we're having more stuff coming up on Wednesday, Thursday. We have a lot of content for you this week, and I'll tell you what that content is at the end. So if you're interested, stay to the end. In any case, this orthodoxy was post-World War II area to Keynesian stabilization policy. And it was basically based on what happened in the 1930s with unemployment. Unemployment was seen as the devil. And that's why the dual mandate, and that's why from this Employment Act, Congress created that on behalf of the people. It actually wasn't the Federal Reserve. Is something interesting, though. These two paragraphs I'm going to read. I'm going to start right here and kind of read down through. This is very important. And this is what I put in the J.M. Bullion article I wrote today. So if you want a written version of this, go to jmbullion.com/blog, and it's got my article. It says here, the idea that monetary policy can and should be used to manage aggregate spending and stabilize economic activity is still a generally accepted tenet that guides the policies of Federal Reserve and other central banks today. But one critical and erroneous assumption to the implementation of stabilization policy of the 60s and 70s was that there existed a stable, exploitable relationship between unemployment and inflation. Specifically, it was generally believed that permanently lower rates of unemployment could be bought with modestly higher rates of inflation. The idea that the Phillips curve represented a longer-term trade-off between unemployment, which was very damaging to economic well-being, and inflation, which was sometimes thought of as more of an inconvenience, was an attractive assumption for policymakers who hoped to forcefully pursue the dictates of the Employment Act. But the stability of the Phillips curve was a fateful assumption, one that economists Edmund Phelps and Milton Friedman warned against. Said Phelps, if the statistical, I think statistical is what it means to say, optimum is chosen, it is reasonable to suppose that the participants in product and labor markets will learn to expect inflation, and that as a consequence of their rationale, anticipatory behavior the Phillips curve will gradually shift upward. In other words, the trade-off between lower unemployment and more inflation that policymakers may have wanted to pursue would likely be a false bargain, requiring ever higher inflation to maintain. So the assumption that you could trade inflation for unemployment has led to the real life scenario of having higher unemployment and inflation at the same time. You can't trade one for the other. One and the other are obviously connected. We now know that sitting here in 2022. What are the lessons? Following that was the collapse of Bretton Woods. The world's industrial nations of Bretton Woods agreed to a global monetary system that would bring greater economic stability, they hoped. It hashed out by 44 nations of Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in 1944, provided for a fixed range of exchange between currencies of the world and US dollar, and the US dollar was linked to gold. But that system had a number of flaws, chief among them the main attempt to maintain fixed parity between global currencies that was incompatible with their domestic goals. In other words, you couldn't have them all pegged to each other when everybody's trying to do different stuff at different times. And it led to governments not really adhering to the system, including the United States, which printed so much money, people started turning it in for the gold because they realized the gold was worth a lot more. All right, keeping going on, then it goes on to explain all of this stuff, what happened afterwards. However, I just kind of wanted to end that there. That's what the Great Inflation was for those that didn't know. That was a period in which we thought we could trade a little bit of money printing for lower employment and then get both, and that's the dual mandate. Well, look at where we are now. If we look at labor force participation rate, the best way to measure labor, we're at a low dating back all the way to the 1970s was the last time we were this low, late 1970s. And then we had a period of all 44 years where we had higher employment until we had within the last couple. So obviously the assumptions made by the economists were wrong in terms of maximizing employment. As far as the debt goes, we've had an explosion in debt. Back, back when a lot of the last time the Great Inflation happened, 65 to 82, in this period, we had very low levels of debt. And so the assumption was that you could basically print and grow your way out. And that's what we did. But now we're at much higher rates. And now we're starting to have what? Higher inflation. Look at the inflation we have here, almost 20% energy, period over period, 7.7% this month. This year, it's been averaging over 8%. So we have high prices and we have low labor participation and more debt than we had this time. So we're not going to be able to go back to those policies that they had last time of just raising interest rates and printing and quantitative easing. It's not going to work. So the Great Inflation this time has to be bigger. It has to be bigger because the monetary aggregate is bigger, but it has to be bigger because there's more debt to clear out of the system, which you're going to have to print more money for. And the inflation is basically, I think, at some point going to go nearly out of control. I think it's going to be just absolutely ridiculous. And I think this time it's going to be much bigger. And I'm speaking with people, interviewing some people for the channel and speaking with people, just that I respect that follow economics and finance. And some people I speak to think that we're going to have a period of sideways movement and then we're going to go back up in terms of corporate growth, in terms of economic growth. And I just don't see it. I just don't know how we do that. How do we do that when we're dealing with high inflation, low labor force participation dating back 44 years, with more debt than ever? And right now we're in a liquidation phase where all the markets are falling. How is the answer to that we just go sideways and we start growing again? If you start printing more money, you're going to risk hyperinflation and collapse of the system. Okay, but you're having issues now with liquidity in the system. You may have to print more money. It's really a tough position that we're in. And if they don't raise interest rates enough, you may not be able to combat existing inflation. It may run away from you unless you can raise interest rates and tamp things down. And when we had the Great Inflation, we had to go above the inflation rate. Interest rates had to go above inflation rate several percentage points to get that system to come back down. And that's without all the debt that we had now. We got about 2.5 times the percentage of debt to GDP we had back then last time this happened. So it was a nice piece written by that gentleman from the Atlanta Fed, and I appreciate him writing that. It was very interesting to see, the Fed so expressly express the problem. I don't think the solution they propose is going to work, but I understand they're in between a rock and a hard place. I don't envy them, but I think for us, what we care about is not the political side of the debate or the academic side of the debate. It's more, what do we do? How do we survive this? And I'll just go back to the gold and silver because I think that argument still is there and will be there. Gold and silver are what's going to hold their value over time. We've seen what's happened to the crypto. They're not quite ready yet. Some of the cryptos like Bitcoin may end up being a store of value. Right now, I don't see how that works, both technically and also with the way the cryptos have reacted. Obviously, they're not there yet. So I don't know where else you go. I don't think you go to bonds and the dollar. I've said that before. All right, ending up the poll. Do you remember the inflation in the 70s? About 60% of you said yes, and another 11% say no, but my parents were there and they told me. And so you have some recollection of what happened. That's pretty good numbers, and hopefully enough people remember that they'll be talking about it and helping the younger crowd sort of prepare for this, because the younger crowd, remember, I'm 48 and I went through the school system, which I think we had a little bit more honesty in economics and finance back then. And then, of course, I was lucky enough to kind of study that on my own as I got older to learn more about finance and economics. And it started with an interest in personal finance and kind of exploded out into macroeconomics and things like that, economic history. But a lot of the younger crowd has grown up in a world of Keynesian economics in which all these assumptions are made, which by that article we saw from the Atlanta Fed, those assumptions were all wrong. So when do we go back and then say, okay, we need to start warning people and talking to people about this? And I think that's probably why I've done at least 7 to 8 shows on inflation this year, because to me, it's the biggest risk. If you're looking at risk factors, it's inflation. And I could just sit there and talk inflation every single episode of this show, hopefully to reach enough people to wake them up, because that's the thing that's going to really, inflation first, high inflation eroding your savings that you haven't had a chance really to get into gold and silver or to protect or to pay off your debt or whatever you're trying to do. And then the hyperinflation that's going to come when they have the debt collapse, which is coming with the economic issues that we're having. And they're going to hyperinflate the currency. And, without gold and silver, I just don't see how people get through that. Hopefully people are listening to that message. And, I'll recommend our providers, ARC Silver, which is @silver.com. You can reach out to Ian there. Just tell him Gold Silver Post sent you, or you can go to goldsilverpros.com and click on the precious metals link, and you can open up an ARC Silver form to contact them that way. They have the lowest premium silver of anybody that I'm aware of. Also, Kinesis.money. We recommend, if you're wanting to store your gold and silver somewhere and have instant access to it via a debit card in the countries which they offer that, and also be able to trade around on their platform. They have different cryptos and things you can trade on the platform. So it's a really interesting platform. We recommend that one as well. For those of you that may be interested in gold and silver, those help the program, or just find a good local coin dealer if you wish. All right, thank you everybody for participating. This one's going to be a little bit shorter than most because it is Thanksgiving Day edition, but I did want to bring that little look back on inflation and talk about how it's going to be different this time and how it's going to be longer, more prolonged, more painful than we had from 1965 to 1982. And there are many reasons for that. We're in a much different fiscal position than we were back then. So the monetary solution to fix the fiscal has to be something else. It has to be something other than the dollar. It has to be gold, silver, and going back to that standard in some way or fashion. And I think that's what Basel III is about. And I think the world's central banks know this. And I think we need to follow their lead and look at gold and silver as that solution for us in the meantime, until we get on the other side of this. All right, this is going to wrap it up, guys. This is going to be a short one, but this is the pre-Thanksgiving edition. Oh, I did promise I'd tell you what content's coming. So I have a nice roundtable on Thursday for you. A couple of gentlemen you guys have seen on the program, which you'll love, to talk silver, because I know you love silver. And if I don't have a silver-focused program every week, I think the natives on the channel get restless. And then tomorrow we have a very special guest appearance. I brought back 𝙎𝙄𝙇, who goes by 𝙎𝙄𝙇 Games on Twitch and Twitter. If you guys have not followed his Twitter, it's a must follow. This guy is a brainiac when it comes to finding things other people don't find, especially when they're data centric. He's a data diver in many ways. He's also very good at putting different things together. I brought him on tomorrow night to talk about the cryptos and FTX and Tether. And you guys have got to see this. The level of Ponzi going on between those three in this space and the potential impact on Bitcoin and the rest of the crypto sphere is going to be very, very interesting. And I'm very excited about this episode because a lot of people that are in gold and silver are also in the cryptos. And what's going on now is very interesting. I don't think this will be the destruction of cryptos. I do think that there's life after, but I do think it's going to change people's opinion on the wild, wild west nature of the cryptos, because that's the phase they're in. They're in an early phase. It's not mature. There's a lot of crap going on. There's a lot of people in there pulling the same games in that field as have been pulled elsewhere in finance. And 𝙎𝙄𝙇 comes on and explains all of how that works. And if you're at all interested in the cryptos, this is a must-see episode. Please tune into this one. It's a firecracker. You guys will like it. All right. We're going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for joining the program. You guys have a very happy Thanksgiving. Tons of content to get you through Thanksgiving, get you away from your in-laws and to your computer. We don't have to hear about your in-laws talking about your lawn or whatever it is. And get a little bit of education time. We got that content for you. So stay tuned to the channel. And tonight, remember, we got all of our old content. You can go back and look at lots of educational stuff there as well. Have a great one. Until next time, Rob Kientz, Gold Silver Pros.